So, hello and welcome back yet again to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. Um, Still haven't seen anything that really casts either Victor or his creation as a modern Prometheus. I mean, maybe the case could be argued that Victor, by bringing the spark of life to his creation, was like Prometheus bringing fire to the humans. Maybe, if I stretch my mind really far for that one, I could maybe grant it. But nonetheless, we are here reading what many consider to be the very first horror novel. I haven't been truly horrified yet, but coming from a modern perspective, I would say that we're pretty jaded. So maybe back in the 1800s, this was utterly terrifying. It's definitely moody. It's very enjoyable. As always, I have to state, I don't really like Victor Frankenstein. He seems like a spoiled little child, honestly, in a lot of this. But it does make for an entertaining story. So we now should be commencing the tale of the creature, where hopefully we won't discover that he's just as problematic as his creator, although he probably is. Let's be fair. Is there anybody that's truly not problematic in some way? Probably not. But, I thus far am definitely sympathizing so much more with the monster than I am with its creator. But anyway, we're going to be jumping back in to volume 2. We're going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 of volume 2 of Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelled at the same time, and it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my senses. By degrees, I remember a stronger light pressed upon my nerves so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me, but I hardly had felt this when, by opening my eyes, I now suppose the light poured in upon me again. I walked, and I believe descended, but I presently found a great alteration in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but now I found that I could wander on at liberty with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked. I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook, resting from my fatigue, until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my almost dormant state, and I ate some berries which I found hanging on the trees or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then, lying down, was overcome by sleep. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold also, and half frightened, as it were, instinctively, at finding myself so desolate. Before I had quit your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of the night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. Soon, a gentle light stole over the heavens and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. I gazed at it with a kind of wonder. It moved slow, but enlightened my path, and I again went out in search of berries. I was still cold when, under one of the trees, I found a huge cloak with which I covered myself and sat down upon the ground. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. Everything was confused. I felt light and hunger and thirst and darkness. Innumerable sounds rang in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on it with pleasure. Several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. I gradually saw plainly the clear stream that supplied me with drink, and the trees that shaded me with their foliage. I was delighted when I first discovered that a pleasant sound which often saluted my ears proceeded from the throats of the little winged animals who had often intercepted the light from my eyes. I began also to observe with greater accuracy the forms that surrounded me, and to perceive the boundaries of the radiant roof of light that canopied me. Sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds that broke out of me frightened me to silence again. The moon had disappeared from the night, and again, with a lessened form, showed itself, and I still remained in the forest. My sensations had by this time become distinct, and my mind received every day additional ideas. My eyes became accustomed to the light and to perceiving objects in their right forms. I distinguished the insect from the herb, and by degrees one herb from another. I found that the sparrow uttered none but harsh notes, whilst those of the blackbird and thrush were sweet and enticing. One day, when I was oppressed by cold, I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars, and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. I examined the materials of the fire, and to my joy found it to be composed of wood. I quickly collected branches, but they were wet and would not burn. I was pained at this, and sat still watching the operation of the fire. The wet wood which I had placed near the heat dried, and itself became inflamed. I reflected on this, and by touching the various branches, I discovered the cause, and I busied myself in collecting a great quantity of wood that I might dry it and have a plentiful supply of fire. When night came on and brought sleep with it, I was in the greatest fear lest my fire should be extinguished. I covered it carefully with dry wood and leaves, and placed wet branches upon it, and then, spreading my cloak, lay on the ground and sank into sleep. It was morning when I awoke, and my first care was to visit the fire. I uncovered it, and a gentle breeze quickly fanned it into a flame. I observed this also, and I contrived a fan of branches which roused the embers when they were almost extinguished. When night came, again I found with pleasure that the fire gave light as well as heat, and that the discovery of this element was as useful to me in my food, for I found that some of the offals that the travelers had left had been roasted and tasted much more savory than the berries that I gathered from the trees. I tried, therefore, to dress my food in the same manner. Placing it on the live embers, I found the berries were quickly spoiled by this operation, but the nuts and the roots were much improved. Food, though, became scarce, and I often spent the whole day searching in vain for a few acorns to assuage the pangs of my hunger. When I discovered this, I resolved to quit the place that I had hitherto inhabited, and to seek for one where the few wants that I experienced could be easily satisfied. In this immigration, I exceedingly lamented the loss of the fire which I had obtained through accident, because I knew not how to reproduce it. I gave several hours to the serious consideration of this difficulty, but I was obliged to relinquish all attempts to supply it, and wrapping up in my cloak, I struck across the woods towards the setting sun. I went 3 days in these rambles, and at length I discovered the open country. A great fall of snow had taken place the night before, and the fields were of one uniform white. The appearance was desolate, and I found my feet chilled by the cold damp outside that was covering the ground. It was about 7 in the morning, and I longed to obtain food and shelter. At length I perceived a small hut on rising ground, which doubtless had been built for the convenience of a shepherd. This was a new sight to me, and I examined the structure with great curiosity. Finding the door open, I entered. An old man was sitting there near a fire, over which he was preparing breakfast. He turned on hearing a noise, and perceiving me, shrieked loudly and ran from the hut across the fields with a speed that his debilitated form hardly appeared capable of. His appearance, different from any I had ever before seen, and his flight surprised me, but I was enchanted by the appearance of the hut. Here the snow and rain could not penetrate, the ground was dry, and it presented to me then as an exquisite and divine a retreat as pandemonium appeared to the demons of hell after their suffering in the lake of fire. I greedily devoured the remnants of the shepherd's breakfast, which consisted of bread, cheese, milk, and wine. The latter, however, I did not like. Then, overcome by fatigue, I lay down on some straw and went to sleep. It was noon when next I awoke, and, allured by the warmth of the sun, which shined brightly on the white ground, I determined to recommence my travels, and depositing the remains of the peasant's breakfast in the wallet that I found, I proceeded across the fields for a few hours until, at sundown, I arrived at a village. How miraculous it appeared! The huts, the neater cottages, and the stately houses engaged my admiration by turn. The vegetables in the gardens, the milk and cheese that I saw placed at the windows of some of the cottages allured my appetite. One of the best of these I entered, but I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked and one of the women fainted. The village was roused, some fled, some attacked me, until, grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel. It was quite bare, and making a wretched appearance after the palaces I had seen in the village. The hovel, however, joined a cottage of neat and pleasant appearance, but after my recent dearly bought experiences, I dared not enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could only with difficulty sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth which formed the floor. At least it was dry, and although the wind entered by innumerable chinks, I did find it an agreeable asylum from the snow and rain. Here then I retreated, and lay down, happy to have found a shelter, however miserable, from the inclemency of the season, and still more happy to have found a refuge from the barbarity of man. As soon as the morning dawned, I crept from my kennel, so that I might view the adjacent cottage and discover if I could remain in the habituation I had found. It was situated against the back of a cottage and surrounded on the sides, which were exposed by a pigsty and a clear pool of water. One part was open, and by that I had crept in, but now I covered every crevice by which I might be perceived with stone and wood, yet in such a manner that I might move them on occasion to pass out. All the light I enjoyed came in through the sty, and that would be sufficient for me. Having thus arranged my dwelling and carpeted it with clean straw, I retired, for I saw the figure of a man at a distance, and I remembered all too well my treatment the night before to trust myself into his power. I had first, however, provided for my sustenance this day with a loaf of coarse bread, which I had purloined, and a cup with which I could drink more conveniently than my hands the pure water that flowed by my retreat. The floor was a bit raised, and my area was kept perfectly dry, and it was close by the vicinity to the chimney of the cottage, so it was tolerably warm. Thus provided for, I resolved to reside in this hovel until something should occur which might alter this determination. It was a paradise, indeed, compared to the bleak forest, my former home, the rain-drooped branches and the dank earth. I ate my breakfast with pleasure, and was about to remove a plank to procure myself a bit of water, when I heard a step, and looking through a chink, I beheld a young creature, with a pail on her head, passing in front of my hovel. The girl was young and of gentle demeanor, unlike what I have since found cottages and house servants to be like. Yet she was very meanly dressed, a coarse blue petticoat and a linen jacket being her only garb. Her fair hair was braided but not adorned. She looked patient and yet sad. I lost sight of her, and in about a quarter of an hour she returned bearing the pail, which was now partly filled with milk. As she walked along, seemingly incommoded by the burden, a young man met her, whose countenance expressed a deeper despondency. Uttering a few sounds with an air of melancholy, he took the pail from her head and bore it to the cottage himself. She followed, and they disappeared. Presently I saw the young man again, with some tools in his hand, crossing the field behind the cottage, and the girl was bruised, or busied, not bruised. And the girl also was busied, sometimes in the house and sometimes out in the yard. Upon examining my dwelling, I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a bit of it, but the panes had been filled in by wood. In one of these was a small, almost imperceptible chink through which an eye could just see. Through the crevice, I could see a small room, whitewashed and clean, but bare of furniture. In one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolate attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer, which employed in her hands, and sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play and produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or nightingale. It was a lovely sight, even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld anything beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent face of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet and mournful song, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his companion, of which the old man took no notice until she sobbed audibly. He then produced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her up and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mix of pain and pleasure like I had never experienced before, either from hunger, cold, warmth, or food. I withdrew from the window, not able to bear these emotions. Soon after, the young man returned, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl met him at the door and helped to relieve him of his burden, and then, taking some of the fuel into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart into a nook of the cottage, and he showed her a large loaf and piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for roots and plants, which she put in water and then upon the fire. Afterwards she continued her work, whilst the young man went into the garden and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. After he had done this for about an hour, the young woman joined him, and they entered the cottage together. The old man, in the meantime, had been pensive, but on the appearance of his companions, he assumed a more cheerful air as they sat down to eat. The meal was quickly dispatched. The young woman was again occupied in arranging the cottage. The old man walked before the cottage in the sun for a few minutes, leaning on the youth's arm. Nothing could exceed in beauty and contrast between these two creatures. One was old, with silver hairs and a face becalming with benevolence and love. The younger one was slight and graceful in his figure, and his features were modeled with the finest symmetry, yet his eyes and attitude expressed the utmost sadness. The old man then returned to the cottage, and the youth, with tools different from those he had used this morning, directed his steps across the field. Night quickly shut in, but to my extreme wonder, I found that the cottagers had a means of prolonging the light by the use of tapers, and I was delighted to find that the setting of the sun did not put an end to the pleasure. I was watching my human neighbors and delighted. In the evening, the young girl and her companion were employed in various occupations which I did not understand, and the old man again took up the instrument which produced the divine sounds that had enchanted me that morning. So soon as he had finished, the youth began, not to play, but to utter sounds that were monotonous and neither resembling the harmony of the old man's instrument, nor the songs of the birds. I have since found out that he was reading aloud, but at the time I knew nothing of the science of words and letters. The family, after having been occupied at this for a while, then extinguished their lights and retired, and I also decided to rest. And that is the end of chapter 3. I'm going to get a drink and be right back. Chapter 4. I lay on my straw, but I could not sleep. I thought of the occurrences of the day. What chiefly struck me was the gentle manners of these people, and I longed to join them, but dared not. I remembered all too well the treatment I had suffered the night before from the barbarous villagers, and I resolved, whatever course of conduct I might hereafter think it right to pursue, that for now I would remain quietly in my hovel, watching and endeavoring to discover the motives which influenced these people's actions. The cottagers arose the next morning before the sun. The young woman arranged the cottage and prepared the food, and the youth departed after the first meal. This day was passed in the same routine as that which had preceded it. The young man was constantly employed outside, and the girl in various laborious occupations inside. The old man, whom I soon discovered to be blind, employed his leisure hours on his instrument or in contemplation. Nothing could exceed the love and respect which the young cottagers exhibited toward their venerable companion. They performed towards him every little office of affection and duty with gentleness, and he rewarded them with benevolent smiles. They were not entirely happy. The young man and his companion often went apart and appeared to weep. I saw no cause for their unhappiness, but was deeply affected by it. If these lovely creatures were miserable, it was less strange that I, an imperfect, solitary being, should be so wretched. Yet, why were these gentle beings unhappy? They possessed a delightful house and every luxury. They had a fire to warm them when cold and delicious foods when hungry. They were dressed in excellent clothes, and still more, they enjoyed each other's companies and speech, interchanging each day looks of affection and kindness. What did their tears imply? Did they express pain? I was at first unable to solve these questions, but perpetual attention and time explained to me many appearances which were at first enigmatic. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the uneasiness of this amenable family. It was poverty, and they suffered that evil to a very distressing degree. Their nourishment consisted entirely of the vegetables of their garden and the milk of one cow, which gave very little in the winter, when its masters could scarce procure food to support it. They often, I believe, suffered the pangs of hunger very poignantly, especially the two young ones, for several times they placed food before the old man and kept none for themselves. This trait of their kindness moved me sensibly. I had been accustomed during the night to steal a part of their stores for my own consumption, but when I found that in doing this I inflicted pain upon them, I abstained and satisfied myself with berries, nuts, and roots which I gathered from the neighboring wood. I discovered also another means through which I was enabled and could assist in their labor. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I would often take his tools, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firings sufficient for the consumption of many days. I remember the first time I did this. The young woman, when she opened the door in the morning, appeared greatly astonished on seeing the great pile of wood. She uttered words in a loud voice, and the youth joined her, who also expressed surprise. I observed this with pleasure, that he did not have to go into the forest that day, but spent it in repairing the cottage and cultivating the garden. By degree, I made discovery of still greater moment. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another with articulate sounds. I perceived that the words they spoke sometimes produced pleasure or pain, smiles or sadness, in the minds and on the faces of the hearers. This was a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it, but I was baffled in every attempt I made. Their pronunciation was quick, and the words they uttered not having any apparent connection with visible objects, so I was unable to discover any clue by which I could unravel the mystery of their reference. By great application, however, and after having remained during the space of several revolutions of the moon inside my hovel, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects that they discussed. I learned and applied the words fire, milk, bread, and wood. I learned also the names of the cottagers themselves. The youth and his companion had each of them several names, but the old man had only one, which was father. The girl was called sister or Agatha, and the youth was Felix, brother or son. I cannot describe the delight I felt when I heard these ideas, and I appropriated each of those sounds which was able to then be pronounced by me. I distinguished several other words without being able as yet to understand or apply them, such as good, dearest, and unhappy. I spent the entire winter in this manner. The gentle manners and beauty of the cottagers greatly endeared them to me. When they were unhappy, I felt depressed, and when they rejoiced, I sympathized in their joy. I saw few human beings beside them, and if any others happened to enter the cottage, their harsh manners and rude gait only enhanced to me the superior accomplishments of my friends. The old man, I could see, often endeavored to encourage his children, as sometimes I found that he called on them to cast off their melancholy. He would talk in a cheerful voice, with an expression of goodness that bestowed pleasure even upon me. Agatha listened with respect, her eyes at times filled with tears, which she tried to wipe away unnoticed, but I generally found that her face and tone were more cheerful after having listened to the exhortations of her father. It was not like this with Felix. He was always the saddest of the group, and even to my unpracticed senses, he appeared to have suffered more deeply than the others. But if his face was more sorrowful, his voice was more cheerful than that of his sister, especially when he addressed the old man. I could tell of innumerable instances which, although slight, marked the dispositions of these amiable cottagers. In the midst of poverty and want, Felix carried with pleasure to his sister the first little white flower that peeped out beneath the snowy ground. Early in the morning, before she had risen, he cleared away the snow that obstructed her path to the milk house. He drew water from the well and brought wood from the outhouse, where, to his perpetual astonishment, he found his storage had always been replenished by an invisible hand. In the day, I believe, he worked sometimes for a neighboring farmer, because he often went forth and did not return until dinner, but brought no wood with him. At other times he worked in the garden, but as there was little to do in the frosty season, mostly he read to the old man and Agatha. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first, but by degrees I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured, therefore, that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood, and I dearly longed to comprehend these also, but how was that to be possible when I did not even understand the sounds for which they were standing as signs? I improved, however, sensibly in this science, but not sufficiently to follow up with any kind of conversation, although I applied my entire mind to the endeavor, for I easily perceived, although I longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I should not make this attempt, not until I had at first become a master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure. For with this also, the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes had definitely made me know. I had admired the forms of my cottagers, their grace, their beauty, their delicate complexion, but oh, how I was terrified when I viewed myself in the pool. At first I stared back, unable to believe that it was indeed I reflected in the mirror, and when I became convinced that I was in reality the monster I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensation of despondency and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. As the sun became warmer, and the light of daytime stronger, the snow vanished, and I beheld the bare trees and black earth. From this time, Felix was more employed, and the heart-moving indications of famine began to disappear. Their food, as I afterwards found, was coarse but wholesome, and they procured a sufficiency of it. Several new types of plants sprung up in the garden, which they dressed, and these signs of comfort increased as the season advanced. The old man, leaning on his son, walked each day at noon when it was not raining. And that is the word for it. I soon found out, when the heavens would pour forth water. This frequently happened, but a high wind would quickly dry the earth, and the season became far more pleasant. My mode of life inside my hovel was uniform. During the morning, I attended the motions of the cottagers, and when they were dispersed on their various occupations, I slept. The remainder of the day I would then spend in observing my friends. When they retired to rest, if there was any moon or the night was starlit, I would go into the woods and collect my own food and fuel for the cottage. When I returned, as often as it was necessary, I would clear from their path the snow and perform these things I had seen done by Felix. I afterwards found that these labors, performed by an invisible hand, astonished them, and once or twice I heard them utter the words "good spirit," "wonderful." I did not understand the significance then. My thoughts now became more active, and I longed to discover the motives and feelings of these lovely creatures. I wanted to know why Felix appeared so miserable and why Agatha was so sad. I thought, foolish wretch that I was, that it might be in my power to restore happiness to these people. When I slept or was absent, the forms of the venerable blind father, gentle Agatha, and excellent Felix would flit before my eyes. I looked upon them as superior beings who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. I formed in my imagination 1,000 pictures of presenting myself to them and their reception of me. I imagined that they would be disgusted, and tell by my gentle demeanor and conciliatory words I should win their favor and maybe even their love. These thoughts exhilarated me and led me to apply with fresh ardor to the acquiring the art of language. My organs were indeed harsh, but supple, and although my voice was very unlike the soft music of theirs, I produced such words that I could understand with tolerable ease. It was like the ass and the lapdog, but surely the gentle ass, whose intentions were affectionate, even if his manners were rude, deserved better treatment than blows. The pleasant showers and the genial warmth of spring altered the aspect of the earth. Men who before this seemed to have been hidden in caves now dispersed themselves and were employed in various arts of cultivation. The birds sang in cheerful notes, and the leaves began to bud forth on the trees. Happy, happy earth! Fit habitation for the gods, which so short a while ago was bleak and damp and unwholesome. My spirits were elevated by the enchanting appearance of nature. The past had been blotted from my memory, my present was tranquil, and my future was gilded by bright rays of hope and anticipation of joy. And that is the end of chapter 4. Yeah, I'm feeling a lot of sympathy and empathy for our monster friend. He seems like so many. I mean, maybe this is a villain origin story, but honestly, he just wants a friend. And who can blame him? I mean, it doesn't matter, even if you're a fairly solitary person, which I consider myself a fairly solitary person, but even I like to see and talk to people. You know, everybody needs someone to consider a friend. So yeah, I am definitely Team Monster. I don't know if that's going to change or not as time goes on, but right now, I'm Team Monster. We need little t-shirts that just say Team Monster and have a picture of Frankenstein on them or something. I would say we also need Team Victor shirts, but I don't know if anybody would want those. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this beginning of our monster's tale, and I will see you tomorrow.